This is an important seminar, and the Quality and Education Improvement Act in California was really a major policy experiment and a major opportunity for research about what works in schools and what doesn't. And PACE worked when the QEIA was first being adopted to try to see if we could play a role in the evaluation. We looked around for partners. We talked to West Ed. We talked to numerous organizations about how are we going to pay attention to what is going on with QEIA. And the answer was, well, nobody was taking this very seriously. Nobody was really looking at this as a learning opportunity, but much more as just the solution to a lawsuit and an allocation of resources. And the California Teachers Association really stepped up on this and paid for an evaluation with their own resources, assigned their own staff to the evaluation. And that's really the only serious evaluation of what happened with QEIA that was undertaken. And I think it's really a tribute to CTA that they accepted that responsibility and took on that challenge, because no one else did. And I say this partly to thank my friends at CTA, but also to say that now California is embarked. If QEIA was about $3 billion, we're now embarked on a policy experiment that's 10 times bigger. And there really is no serious commitment to tracking what happens with this massive experiment that we're undertaking in California. And I doubt, I'll ask Cousteau after the meeting, if CTA is going to pay for an evaluation, but I doubt it. And yet we're engaged in a pretty dramatic departure from the policy frame that we have been operating under for the last 10, 20 years. And will we know if it works or not? Well, nah, not really. We don't really, we're not going to take that seriously. We're just going to let things roll out and then see if we're happy, 5 or 6 years from now. And I think that's a shame. And so I think, that the fact that CTA committed to an evaluation of QEIA gives us information that we would not otherwise have had about what's working and what's not. And it's simply a shame, and I will say this as an editorial comment, simply a shame that we're not going to take this massive policy experiment that we're now embarking on, take that with the same seriousness. So apologies for intruding on your time and intruding on Jane's and Courtney's time, but I'm sad to see that we're not going to look at this with the care that it deserves. With that said, I'm delighted to introduce Jane Robb and Courtney Malloy, who are today's speakers. Jane is a member of the CTA staff in the Department of Instruction and Professional Development. Courtney is a senior researcher at Vital Research and an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. And I'm happy to turn the floor over to them.
Well, thank you, David, so much. I really want to thank PACE for giving us the opportunity to share this information with you. And you are welcome to intrude on our time when you say things like that. That was not only true, but very kind. And I think one of the things that we want to try to accomplish today is to share with you both a summary of findings from 2 publications that we've released in the last couple of months that are reporting what we found. As David said, CTA really did commit early at the very beginning of QEIA to do a long-term comprehensive evaluation of the program. And so at that point we contracted with Vital Research and really have worked with them now for 7 years to watch this. And what we're seeing as we're getting towards the end of end of QEIA is what we've learned. So we're going to share with you some of the findings from the first 2 reports. There are 3 more coming out. These first 2 are really on implementation of the program and practices in the program. The 3rd report is really going to look at the policy and fiscal environment and how that affected QEIA. The 4th one will be looking really at the role of unions in reform, and the 5th is going to be sort of a summary report at the end. So those will be released over the next year and a half. What we do want to do today, though, as well as share these findings, is do a little bit of the walk and look at the similarities about what's going on in the new policy context of LCFF and what QEIA has to say that may be of value as we embark on this grand experiment. Because we were the grand experiment, QEIA, and now we have a grander one. But there are lessons learned that can translate over. So very, very briefly, just to remind you, QEIA is a $3 billion program. It was originally put in place through legislation for 7 years. It has been extended for an 8th year. Next year is the final year of the program. There were requirements that were in QEIA. Most of you know these. The roughly 400 schools that were funded, originally about 500, now it's a little less than 400 schools are still in the program, were given a set of resources. And they were asked to actually improve the instruction of students in their school using the resources. The resources that they were given and that they were asked to utilize was funding for class size reduction, additional funding over than the K-3 funding that was already in place. They were asked to make sure that teachers at their QEIA schools had experience that was equal to or greater than the average teacher experience in their district for the type of school, this grade level of school. All the professional staff at schools, teaching staff, administrative staff, and instructional paraprofessional staff were required to engage in professional development that had certain requirements. Each of the districts that had QEIA schools were asked to make sure that the administrators of those schools were exemplary administrators. And then for high schools, there was a 300-to-1 student counselor ratio that had to be maintained. The Williams Act applied to all QEIA schools, whether or not they would have been in that group anyhow. And all of these things were intended to result in improved student outcomes. The measure for those outcomes was API. And so originally the schools had a 3-year period to exceed their API targets on average over those first 3 years in order to continue in the program. So you'll hear a little bit more about that from Courtney as she goes through the findings. The timeline implementation, it was originally started in 2007-08 with a planning year, and schools were given a 3-year period for full implementation. So much like LCFF, funding increased, and as funding increased, additional responsibilities were put on the schools to put these infrastructure in place.
Jane, for a second, do you mind standing on this side because we're having a hard time seeing you?
Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background, the demographics of students in QEIA schools. All of the QEIA schools were originally decile 1 and 2 schools. Not surprising, about 80% of the students served in those schools were Latino Hispanic students. 90% qualified for free and reduced lunch, and about half of the elementary students and a little less of the secondary students were English learners. So what you'll see, again drawing the parallels, are the students that have been participating in the QEIA program are very similar in their profile overall to some of the students that are going to be generating income under the local control funding formula. And I will hand this over to Courtney.
So I'm going to talk a bit about the findings from the research that was conducted at Vital Research. And just to contextualize what we focused on, as Jane mentioned, there's a publication series that's coming out, and each piece has a slightly different focus. These questions represent the questions that we were seeking to answer, I think, in the first 2 reports. More reports will drill down in other various areas as we go forward. But if you take a look, we were really focused on how it was implemented. So we knew that there were regulations. We were curious about to what extent those regulations were being implemented as designed. We also were interested in what other things schools were doing. QEIA was also about empowering schools to take on their own reforms with the resources that they received and make decisions about how to use that funding. And we were very curious about what they chose to do with those resources. We also wanted to know a fair amount about the challenges that they were facing, and this became a very important question to ask given the context that we've been sort of living in over the last few years. We hadn't expected it when we started in 2007, but there were considerable challenges, and so we became very interested in trying to unpack what some of those were. We also wanted to know what the perceived impacts were. We certainly were looking at API and who was meeting API because that was an important piece of the regulation, but we knew that there were other impacts that schools and stakeholders were feeling and experiencing as a result of their participation. We also became very, very interested in the schools that were having great successes, and like with any reform, we found these schools, these high-flying schools, and we wanted to know a little bit more about how they would account for that success so that other schools could learn from whatever that was. And that became the focus of our second report in particular that I'll talk a bit about today as well. So the data sources, as Jane mentioned, we've been engaged in this for a number of years, and we've asked a lot of questions over these years. But one of the things, and this work in particular, is based on the case studies that we did years 3, 4, and 5. And we ended up meeting and talking with stakeholders in about 34 QEIA schools over a 3-year period. We also did district interviews, so we interviewed the folks that were most responsible for working with QEIA in their districts, and we covered about half the districts that have QEIA schools, which is a considerable amount. There's about 140 districts with QEIA schools. We also talked to about half of the counties that have QEIA schools in them, and then have obviously been looking at a variety of documents over time. We did a principal survey for every year for the first several years, and also have just looked at the publicly available data that we all have access to that's put out by CPE. So just to give you, this is a bit small, but this is also in the report, so I'll just highlight a couple things. One of the things that we saw when we took a look at what was happening with the legislative requirements, the actual resources that Jane mentioned that were provided to schools and whether or not schools met those requirements. For year 2 and for year 3, we did really well. You know, year 1 was the planning year, but year 2 and year 3, those incremental milestones. In year 4, it began to be a little bit more difficult to hit full implementation, and that corresponded directly with some of the financial challenges that schools were suddenly facing in the new fiscal context. And so what became more difficult was reducing class size reduction, the full amount that was necessary. And so we saw a number of schools that were exited because they couldn't meet class size reduction or their API growth, which was here. One of the things that I think is noteworthy about that is that at the same time, many schools and districts started to apply for waivers from some of these requirements. And we've been tracking the waivers, and there'll be a bit more of this on the third report, but I know that there were a couple questions about it before the presentation. So, you know, as of March 2013, and we're updating that for our next report, there were 169 waivers that were for 132 schools. So out of roughly 500, 132 schools is a fair amount of schools that were running what we would consider a modified version of this program. We're not, you know, completely implementing it the way that we had intended. So we're going to spend some more time on that in our third report, because I think that's really interesting, that try to explain a little bit more about some of the things that were happening in the context that created this situation with sort of these waivers and this need to waive out. There were 3 primary goals of schools. Whenever we went, we talked to folks about what they were trying to accomplish. You know, what was first and foremost on everyone's mind, of course, was improving student learning. First and foremost, and what we heard most common, was that it was about improving test scores. We did hear, particularly in the schools that I think were having greater successes, that they were interested in developing their whole child and in a broader sense of learning than one was just measured by the test scores. And we did see that in a number of high-flying schools. A real desire to work with their kids and prepare them for lifelong learning, prepare them for college, prepare them for something that was beyond just the grade level that they were in right now and how they performed on a test. We also heard that goals were very focused on fostering teacher growth. That's not surprising because professional development was one of those key regulations, so we would expect to see goals that were aligned with that. And schools chose to work on fostering teacher growth by strengthening teacher collaboration. There was a huge push for that, consistent with what we see in the field right now as well as enhancing the quality of the professional development that schools were receiving. Enhancing structures to support instruction was the last piece that schools really focused on. They were often putting new programs in place. They were deciding to use data in a new way. They were also adopting new models and frameworks. That was really common, to go out and adopt a new framework for working with students that they hadn't had before as a result of QEIA. So we'll unpack some of that a little bit right now. So key initiatives and strategies that we saw when we went out to schools: hiring staff and teachers, engaging in professional development, supporting teacher collaboration, of course reducing class sizes as a big piece of the regulations, and then also implementing some other interventions. Let's unpack these for a moment. In terms of hiring staff and teachers, that was something that they needed to do under QEIA, particularly for class size reduction. But there were also a few of those regulations that were around having high quality teachers or having teachers with the right amount of experience so that they were raising the experience levels of their schools. And so not surprisingly, schools were very focused on this. One of the things that we heard folks say, however, was that they used this as a real opportunity to think through what they needed. So it wasn't just about moving the teachers around necessarily. In a few of our high-performing schools, they took an opportunity to really build teaching staff that they needed. We heard a story from a middle school principal who he talked about how class size reduction in middle school was so new for the school. They didn't quite know how to deal with it. They knew that they needed to use new instructional strategies and wanted to because they had this opportunity, yet they didn't have the capacity in the school site. And so one of the things that had happened in their district right around when they needed to hire was that several elementary schools had been laid off, unfortunately. But what they saw that as was an opportunity to pull those elementary school teachers that were effective teachers that had class size reduction experience into the middle school because they had multiple subjects, and the way that people taught, they were able to do that in this middle school. And those people brought and mentored other teachers in effective class size reduction policies, or other in effective class size reduction strategies. So we saw the opportunity to hire in staff as an opportunity to pull in new skills and expertise that were needed. Professional development was another. Yes?
Can you just tell me a little bit more what class size reduction strategies are?
For sure. You know what? It's coming. How about that? Okay. So one of the things that we also saw was a considerable push towards the kinds of professional development that folks were attempting. And again, we used the lens where we started to look at, okay, well, what are some of the more effective schools doing around professional development? And what are those teachers saying about the most effective professional development that they saw? And consistent with the field, this is very consistent with what we know about effective professional development, but this is from the words of teachers in highly effective QEIA schools. They saw that the professional development had 6 key components, really. The first was that it was teacher-driven. And by teacher-driven, I don't mean that individual teachers picked their own. I mean that they had a voice somewhere in the school that helped them participate in the decision. And I say that because that idea about picking your own is very counterintuitive to another element here about being coherent. So in addition to being teacher-driven, the professional development was also coherent and cohesive and connected to the school plan. So everyone was doing a similar thing. The school would make a decision. This year we really want to focus on math, on a certain math program or a math instructional strategy. That meant that everyone was focused on it. Now the teachers had a voice in making that decision, either through committee or voting or recommendation and endorsing it. But everyone was focused on it. There wasn't this sense that like all this fragmented development that was occurring at the school site where it wasn't coherent and part of a focused, cohesive plan. It being personally relevant also mattered a great deal to the teachers in the schools that we visited. Teachers needed to feel like if they went to a professional development session, that whatever was occurring there was directly relevant to who they served, who they taught, what they needed. There was plenty of professional development that folks talked about where I went and I couldn't even figure out what to use or why I should be there. So this really accounted for more effective opportunities. High quality, the things that you might be familiar with that are high quality. Having knowledgeable experts, people told horror stories about some of the professional development that they had, the kinds of people that were speaking to them that might not even have any understanding of what was going on in their school. But also having good materials, good engaging presenters, reasons to be there for a whole day. Support and feedback. Folks really wanted to, when they left, to have the ongoing support and feedback that the literature already tells us is important, but these teachers also viewed that as key. Professional development was more effective when they could try something when they came back, evaluate whether or not it went well, get additional support and technical assistance to tweak it if they needed to, and give feedback and get feedback. It wasn't just come sit here and then I go back to my school and do it without any other reflection on what that particular strategy or piece of development was. And then lastly, actionable and immediate. It was very important for teachers to be able to use whatever they learned the next day. If it was something that they needed to purchase to be able to do it, or some equipment that hadn't come to the school site so that they couldn't do it, it wasn't nearly as useful as if they could just try it the next day and if they could see the results of it the next day. So there are plenty of strategies that are intended perhaps to show up on testing at the end of the year. That was too long to wait to find out if it worked. There had to be something built in where I could use it right away and determine if it was effective right away, or else I wasn't going to keep, I'm not going to keep doing it. Those were the kinds of things that we heard from teachers. In terms of teacher collaboration, this was sort of an interesting piece that shouldn't have surprised us, but I think it did. Because what QEIA allowed for was to meet your professional development requirement, the hour requirement that you had, by collaborating or by doing sort of workshop kinds of professional development. We had a lot of schools opt to do more teacher collaboration to meet the requirement than they had before. And so it became a really huge piece of what schools had put in place that they hadn't had before. Or they put in place more of it or more structured teacher collaboration than they had before because it met this requirement. And one of the things that we saw when we looked at the schools that seemed to really credit teacher collaboration for their improvement taking off, they had highly collaborative structures and cultures, we saw that there were some foundational prerequisites here at the bottom that I'll talk about in a minute, that when these were present, it allowed, and coupled with supportive structures, with actual structures in the school site, it allowed for some pretty amazing growth and some things to happen at the school. And so let me unpack these for a moment. Some of the foundational prerequisites that were present in these schools where collaboration really was making a difference were commitment, willingness to innovate, trust and respect, and supportive leadership. These sound like things that we all know, but one of the things that we learned was that it didn't necessarily have to be that everyone was committed, but it had to be that enough were committed, because there will always be some teachers that are not interested in teacher collaboration, or some stakeholders that are, because you have to be vulnerable. In order to really collaborate, you have to put yourself out there, you have to trust your colleagues. But what happened was, if there was enough teachers, people would start to come along. So many schools talked about this critical mass of commitment, enough there to start. They also talked about the importance of willingness to innovate. It wasn't just willingness to collaborate, it was willingness to try something new. You had to be willing, if the collaboration is going to take you anywhere, you have to be willing to make mistakes, to try something new, to fail. And so we all know that not all school cultures will embrace that concept, But in some schools, leadership, teachers, all of the leaders endorsed this idea, hey, go try it and tell us how it works. And it was okay if it didn't work well. They would just figure out what to try next. Trust and respect. This is about that sort of mutual trust and respect for other people's ideas and for the things that they may be doing, and knowing that you can trust others to be vulnerable, because true collaboration requires you to say, hey, I don't know how to do this right now. And if you don't trust or respect the person that you're trying to work with to figure out how to do it better, go anywhere. And then finally, supportive leadership. And for the schools that we saw where collaboration took off, the leaders didn't just let collaboration happen. They moved heaven and earth a little bit to make it happen. They found time in the school day. They found subs. They found resources. They made a commitment to it so that teachers could get together and collaborate. It was more than just endorsement. It was, okay, this is a priority and I'm going to do whatever I can to make it happen so that you guys can continue to work together. The kinds of structures that were created to really support this when the prerequisites were in place, defined teams. And this was super important. There were some schools that we saw that had like whole school collaboration at times, but really the places where it was really effective, they were clearly defined teams with a clearly defined specific purpose and clear expectations. So I know I'm meeting with these people to do this for this much time every week, and it was very defined. It wasn't just, well, we bank our time on Tuesdays and whoever comes, and we try to like share things. It was a defined team. We are meeting together every week, and everybody knew who the team was and they knew what the team was supposed to do. A dedicated architect, these teams had somebody who was responsible for pulling everyone together, somebody who had an agenda, showed up and made sure it was built and that people were there and knew what they were doing. Sometimes this was the principal. Oftentimes it might start with the principal and then it eventually got handed over to somebody else on the staff. But there was someone who was the champion and the architect of the actual collaboration. Scheduled time, I talk about this. It was built in. It was not just expected to occur on its own with people finding time in their calendars. It was scheduled and it was ongoing. A specific purpose. People knew what they were collaborating. There were goals, or there were questions being answered. There were deliverables that were expected. It wasn't just let's come sit here and chat about how it's going this week, okay? Branding was the last piece that I really want to talk about because I found this really interesting. In schools where collaboration was really driving what was happening, if you went in and you talked to a teacher and you said, well, tell me about your collaboration in one of these schools, they would say, oh, Wild Wednesdays. Or they would say, oh, Harvesting Brilliance. And everybody would say the same thing, and they knew what it was called, and they knew how to describe it. It was branded. I mean, it became a thing that people could point to. And it was pretty amazing to hear the same teachers, because in many of the schools we interviewed, 5 teachers, and we surveyed them as well. All of the surveys, and out of their mouths, all say the same thing. Give us the same vision for the meeting. Give us the same purpose. Give us the same expectations. It had become branded in a way in the institution that I think was really exceptional. When we saw those things happen, we ended up seeing enhanced data use. Many times these meetings were structured around data, and so because the right structures were in place and the people were willing and committed and vulnerable, they would look at data and they would use it and they would talk about it. It wouldn't just be reports that would come out that might make people feel bad, per se. They were used for a really meaningful reason. Certainly professional community, as you might imagine, increased sense of sharing and collegiality, reciprocity around sharing was certainly present. Cohesion and coherence I want to talk about for a minute, because what many effective collaborating schools did was that they worked on time to align and get on the same page. And what that did was that meant that if I sit in this classroom or that classroom, I have the same experience. And they talked about that. They talked about striving for that, regardless of which teacher you're with, that you're getting the same experience. And they talked about the importance of aligning for the next grade, bringing in people from the next grade to figure out, okay, how can we make sure we cover what's needed? So it moved to a place where, folks at the school knew what they were doing at 10 a.m. They knew what they were doing that week. they knew what was needed for the next grade. It was pretty amazing. So there was a real sense of alignment and cohesion around the campus. So let's talk a little bit about class size reduction now. And this is in the report because I realize that this is really small. So you'll get this in the downloaded report. I think all of these, though, are in the highlights that were in the back, too. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. You know, there's a lot of research out there on, you know, that answers the question, does class size reduction work? It's a yes, no, like answer. You know, it either improves student achievement or it doesn't. And there's lots of evaluation work out there that does that. You know, and we know as a community that the studies are mixed, or it works sometimes, or it works with some kids more than it works with others, or it didn't work in this case and then it worked in this case. I mean, but we still keep asking that question, and I've become a little bit more interested in, okay, you reduce class size and then you measure student achievement. There's all this stuff in the middle that we don't understand, right? Because certainly if you just reduce class size and you do the same thing you were doing, I don't think I would see any change. I mean, why would I? There's no theoretical reason why I would see change. So, but when you go and you talk to teachers, they all say class size reduction has made all the difference. When I went to high-performing schools, the number one thing, when I said what accounts for your success, the number one thing that I heard was class size reduction. So we became more interested in, okay, well, what happens between reduction and measurement? And this is what reflects that, I think, for us. So we'll unpack this a bit. Because what we have are we have some immediate results and we have what we've termed level 1 impacts and level 2 impacts. So the immediate result of class size reduction, if you do nothing else, you don't change anything about your instruction, is that it's easier to manage your classroom. There are fewer students in the room. That's going to make your life easier, okay? If I take a look at this opportunity that I now have as a teacher, I've got greater ease of classroom management. It's easier for me, fewer bodies, okay? I can leverage this opportunity, right, in some way. Now, the level 1 impacts that I see, if I just have greater ease, is that I'm going to get a decreased workload. I've got fewer papers to grade, right? If I do nothing else, nothing different. Fewer papers to grade, my day goes a little bit better, I've got fewer students to meet up with or touch base with, so my workload is going to be decreased. I'm also going to get more instructional time. This is one of the things the teacher talked about. If I spend less time on classroom management, I get more time. It may be a few minutes, but those few minutes add up over time, so I get more time. I also get what many people talked about as a better learning environment for the students. It's an environment. It doesn't mean, I'm not necessarily saying that they're learning more, but the environment is better because there's fewer people in the room, there's more distractions, there's greater ease of classroom management, there's fewer disruptions, okay? And so decreased workload, the level 1 impact that we observed was increased teacher morale, okay? So again, we haven't done anything to change our instruction yet. But we receive this. It feels better to go to work every day, okay? I mean, that's a good thing, right? It feels better to go to work every day. And there's an opportunity for students to engage more because there's less disruption, okay? If we move to this level 2, and this is where we felt like it started to get interesting and we'd like to continue thinking through this as researchers, is that now I have this decreased workload and I have this more instructional time. Do I just rest on decreased morale or increased morale? Do I rest on feeling better when I go to work every day? Or do I take this opportunity, more time, less work, to do something different? And this is where, when we started looking at schools, they really talked about class size reduction changing their practice, not just liking it. Because there were some schools that liked it and were happy with the teacher climate piece. But there were other schools that said, I have all this time and I have less bodies, so this is what I do. So we became interested in capturing that. So some of the things that they do is they vary their instructional methods. With 30 plus kids in the class, they might not have ever put kids in small groups or done dyads or done pairs or even done student-led instruction. They would have never gone near it because it would have been a discipline nightmare. With 20 kids in a class, they'll give that a shot because it's less to manage. So they would vary their instructional methods. They would also try something new because it wasn't so chaotic in their classroom, so they could try something that they never tried before because they weren't necessarily afraid of what would go wrong. Okay, it was a lot easier rather to innovate. They also would assess and review data more. So, I mean, are there any teachers in the room? Or people who have taught at some point, right? I'm a faculty member. I hate to grade. I will fully fess up, I hate to grade. So if I have a lot of grading to do, I'm not going to try to minimize how much assessment I do, just merely because I don't enjoy grading. And so imagine if all of a sudden the grading that you have to do can be reduced. You're going to get better feedback more often, and you're going to look at it more often. And many teachers talked about the fact that they weren't, because they didn't have to get bogged down by grading, they were likely to actually assess more because they could, and they would also look at it more, and they would get better feedback because of it. So they assessed and reviewed data more often. And then finally, they took the time to strengthen their personal relationships with students. If I have 20, I can have better relationships with the students in my class than I can if I have 30. I can touch them one-on-one more often, in terms of contacts and touch points. If I'm in small groups more often or in, dyad instruction and I have to follow up with students, I actually get more contact with them than I would if they were just sort of in a traditional setting where maybe I never had innovated. So what the perceived impacts, and indeed these are perceived, right? That's the kind of work that we did here. But the perceived impacts of these changes were that teachers talked about having a greater awareness of student needs. They knew their students better because of the personal relationships and the more face time, but also because they were looking at data more often and assessing more frequently. They felt like this led to higher quality instruction because they changed their instruction. They varied it more based on the needs in their classroom because they knew more about their students. And lastly, they felt like students were more engaged because there was more variation in instruction, and students appreciated the group work and appreciated the different styles that were happening. Lastly, just to touch on this very, very briefly, because I'm aware of time, there were a few other interventions that some schools implemented. These were less common than the ones that I talked about before, but for sure, more time for core instruction was talked about often. And what I mean by that is that they would block the day differently to try to get more time for math and English. They would add intervention time during lunch or time during after school, or something special on Saturdays, but it was all focused on just finding more time for math and English and just that core instruction. And for intervening in particular with struggling learners so that they could catch them up quicker. Certainly some schools implemented new technology. One of the common things, we certainly heard about smart boards, but we also heard about things like Quizdom or polling systems so that teachers could get instant feedback in the classroom. That was somewhat popular. Some other enrichment programs, I mentioned some schools were focused on the whole child. So we saw things like peace builders come in, particularly in places where, I don't know if you know that program, but it's kind of a conflict resolution, peace building kind of curriculum that's all school, from staff to kids. It's a culture building program. And those were adopted in places where they had maybe more violence or bullying because they really felt that that would be useful. And then there was the Sparkling 10, and I put this on there. This is one school, but it was really fascinating to me. They were looking at their data, and they started realizing that a lot of the kids that were involved in more discipline problems, that a lot of their struggling learners, the ones that weren't doing as well, were also involved in more discipline problems and were suspended more and were more truant and absent. And so what they decided to do was they, instead of tackling, of course they were tackling the learning and the instruction, but they decided they needed more. So what they did was they took a list of these kids that had all of these discipline problems, and they assigned 10 of them to each teacher. And their goal was to reach out to this student, daily, weekly, to build more of a personal relationship with them and to really focus on them to try to get them more engaged in the classroom. And they saw their discipline issues decrease dramatically because teachers were reaching out in hallways and at recess, and teachers knew, okay, here are my Sparkling 10 that I really have to focus on trying to reach out to.
Were there achievement changes too with those students?
No, we didn't, they perceive that it did, but what they really told us about was drops in discipline, referrals, suspensions with that particular set. In fact, they said that I think the number that they gave me was like 80 to 90% with that set of kids.
Was that in elementary, middle?
It was in
That was a high school.
No, it was a high school.
Was it a high school? I'm sorry, it's in the report.
Okay.
Some of it like fails me. I can look for you in a moment. The example is in the larger report that you can download. So, exemplary leaders. Judy mentioned that there was a requirement to have an exemplary leader placed at every QEIA school. One of the things that we learned about, which is also in the report, was that to some extent this wasn't really actualized in the way that it might have been intended. It was for districts to sort of decide, okay, here's our criteria of exemplary administrators, and now we're going to hire based on this. And when we did our district interviews, we learned by and large that there wasn't a whole lot of action there. You know, districts would certainly say that they had exemplary administrators, but they hadn't done anything different than they had done in the past to put the administrator in there. So we sort of see this as, and there's really not a whole lot of teeth. There's not county monitoring or money linked at all to doing this in a really overt way. So it's one of those things that just didn't happen the way it was intended. And we'll spend some more time on that in the next report. But one of the things that we learned, and we all know this in this room because we know schools, is that an administrator, a leader, a principal is super, super critical. And in our high-performing schools, they commonly talked about, you know, another factor. CSR was first, but leadership rose to the top as well, having an exemplary leader. And one of the things that we noticed that was really loud, in our case studies, we had some schools that were, we had a couple that were even exited, but we had some lower performing schools and kind of middle performing schools, and then we had some that were like high flyers. I mean, amazing, you don't even hear about it kind of growth. And when they talked about their principals, these amazing growth schools glowed about their principals. And then when other stakeholders talked about their principal, it was lukewarm at best. Yeah, they're okay. Yeah, they've got some strengths, they've got some weaknesses. And then you go over here and you talk to teachers in these exemplary schools. I mean, it was just amazing, the difference. And in the exemplary schools, what we noticed was that the leadership manifested these characters that we identified as really critical to effective leaders. We identified 20 characteristics that were common across all the high-performing schools when they talked about their principals. So there's more on that in the first report that you can download, the larger report. Challenges, I think folks in the room all know about the challenges. I'm just going to pick off the first three. Financial challenges were huge, huge. Because this reform happened at a time when we had the state budget crisis, when the fiscal context was so uncertain. And what that ended up resulting in was a situation where the dollars that we thought were necessary for class size reduction, and there could be some left over, were largely being used for CSR. So budgets were entirely being used to support CSR because districts were raising K-3 class size requirements because they could, but in order to stay in QEIA, you still had to have the K-3 target, so schools needed to use more money than they thought. So the financial challenges were quite large and made it difficult for schools to implement CSR in particular. The financial challenges, though, also led to staffing and turnover issues. Schools talked about like losing, you know, huge percents of their staff every year because of the shuffle that was happening at the districts around class size reduction and where teachers were going. So many of our schools talked about we just got this momentum going and then we lost all these teachers and now we have new ones. So they were constantly restarting with their visions and their missions and getting people together and starting collaboration teams. And I think that was a pretty huge challenge for them. In terms of perceived impacts, one of the things that we have been doing is we have been looking at the performance using some of the publicly available data. We've certainly been looking at API. And in the report, you'll have the percents of schools that were meeting their API requirements. But you know, if you do research in the state or you're involved at all in policy in the state, you know how difficult it is to ever measure how well schools are doing. And one of the things that we have with this is it's very interesting is you have such a long reform, and kids when they move to middle school, it doesn't mean they necessarily move to a QEIA middle school, and this is a particularly transient population, so even sort of reining it all in so that you have enough data can be challenging. But what this does, and again in the highlights you can see it if you need to look at it, it's in the back, is this scale right here. This is the average distance from the API median of similar schools. And in the state of California, what we do is that every school is given 100 similar schools that are like them, and that's based on the school characteristics index. So what we did to try to get a sense of, okay, well, how well are our schools doing relative to other schools like them, was we took the distance between each one of our schools and the predicted, where the state would predict that they should be, and that's something called API median in the research files. And it is the median performance of all of their similar schools. And we took the distance between those, because if you figure out if they're at 0, right, they have the exact same API as the API of all their similar schools. If they're below that, then they're underperforming compared to the median of their similar schools. If they're above that, they're overperforming. And we thought that that might be an interesting way to take a look at this data. When we did this right here would be similar performance on average to similar schools, the 0. In 2006, 2007, okay, and these lines represent different levels of QEIA. We'll just work with the green line right now. This is elementary schools. They were underperforming by about 35 average API points compared to the median of their similar schools. It makes sense. They were the decile 1 and 2 schools. I mean, they were struggling, correct? If you follow the line over time, and again, their similar schools might change, but we're still comparing, we're still subtracting their median from the median of their similar schools. That average, they've surpassed that average. There's quite a bit of incremental growth. And that's one of the things that we've seen since the beginning, is that this has really made a difference, I think, in elementary schools in particular, or in many of them. The lines here are a little bit different. You know, there's some sort of upwards movement, but there's also some down movement. And for a lot of QEIA schools, it parallels what we see, I think, across the state, too, in terms of what's happening with API scores. Now, the really interesting thing here is that we don't really have anything that we can do this year. Relative to this, we're all sort of in flux whenever we're trying to measure how well schools are doing. But this was sort of our best shot to kind of look at something beyond just whether or not schools met API or did not meet API. Several schools also talked about the improved reputation that resulted from being a part of QEIA and just doing better. And you know, this may seem like a throwaway to some of the people in the room, but if you go into these struggling schools, these schools that have been in PI for years and years and years, and these teachers that have tried and tried and tried, and every year someone says, you are not doing well, you are not doing well, you are not doing well. The idea that you start to see growth and get excited about it means a lot. It does a lot for the climate, it does a lot for the culture, and so it's not a throwaway. Getting recognition, you know, from others means a lot because it builds some new climate and some new capacity in terms of just the emotional resistance that you need to sometimes engage in this work. Improved climate is really key too. The staff really felt like all of the collaboration and all of the work that they were doing led to some really important climate changes. And then some schools focused specifically on parent involvement, and they talked about how that led to more parent participation. They also talked about just doing better led to parent participation as the school was doing better and the reputation was improving. They just saw parents come around more often or be more invested or more interested in what was happening in the school. So what I want to end on before I turn it over to Jane quickly is the second report, and I want to highlight it very quickly, and it goes over sort of some of what we've already talked about. So we became really interested in, okay, if we know we have some of these schools that are high flyers, what would I really account for their change according to them? Sort of what was their tipping point? Because many schools have them. There's the one, if we asked them what was the one thing that you did that made all the difference, what would they say? And there's a methodology called critical incidence methodology from the 50s that we used for this, where what we did was we selected 10 schools that were considered our exemplary schools. And we interviewed or surveyed principals or teachers in those schools, and we gathered some what we call our critical incidents. We asked them, what was your tipping point? Can you explain it to me and explain the difference that it made on your school? And then we analyzed those stories of those critical incidents. We call them pathways to success. But we chose our schools based on a general upward trend over time since they've had. So this is that same median analysis, and then this is 0. So this is where all of our exemplary schools were before, and you can see all of them have sort of they've had a couple dips in the road, but in general, they certainly have had good success. So when we analyzed these incidents, we came to 7 core, what we're calling pathways to change, or incidents. And we collected about, there were 135 that we analyzed. We collected a few more of that, but we threw out some incidents that were either non-specific. I mean, it was, every once in a while we get someone who would say, oh, it was everything. Everything we did really, really mattered. So that wasn't something that we could really extrapolate anything from. So we threw those out. We also threw out anyone that said, like, lots of things where we couldn't pick something, like where there wasn't a primary one that they were talking about. So if they said something like, oh, it was class size, and it was leadership, and it was collaboration, they would get thrown out just because they were mentioning too many. And what we wanted was the primary one. We wanted them to settle on one. So this is what we arrived at. As I mentioned to you before, reducing class size was the single most common thing that people talked about as being their critical incident. And it was relatively loud. That collaboration was also extremely important. We've talked a bit about reducing class size already, so I'm going to skip this slide. But as a pathway, hugely important to the schools that we visited. Leveraging collaboration time, the one thing I'll say about this is that it wasn't the collaboration itself, it was that the collaboration was a gateway to other important activities. When we really unpacked these incidents, what we were learning was that teachers were planning together, aligning their instruction and sharing practice. And it was those 3 activities that were, perhaps collaboration was the catalyst to, or that it facilitated, that were really critical, not the collaboration itself. And responding to student needs, I mean, it's the title is sort of relatively generic, but one of the things that, if you read the piece, that you'll notice that we talk about is it was this idea that the instruction that was provided was very needs focused, so that you had the right students being intervened with at the right times. Okay, that it wasn't just this is the instruction and if people get it, they don't get. I mean, they get it or they don't get it. That teachers were very focused on the needs of the folks in their class and responding to that precisely. The same thing would be true. I mean, here's a really great example. One of the things that one of our schools did was they designed a freshman academy. We've all heard about freshman academies, but they were very targeted in who was selected to go to the freshman academy. And what they found out that precipitated the design was that the students, that there were huge numbers of students that weren't ready for their sophomore year and would have to be held back. So what they did was they came up with who they thought, like what described the profile of those students, and those students ended up in the academy. And there were after school classes, they were just very focused on these students and responding to their needs, not just letting them go through and not make it at the end without their A through G, or perhaps not graduating and dropping out. They crafted an intervention specifically focused on these students because they were such a high need group. Building local accountability was another one that came up. And I think that this is really interesting in light of LCFF. But one of the things that folks talked about was they talked about how there was time spent at the beginning to really build the local accountability. So somebody set goals, somebody measured goals, they talked about them school-wide, everybody knew what they were. They held folks accountable to those goals. You know, collaboration time was about collaborating. You know, you didn't bring your magazines and you didn't bring your grading and you weren't doing it while people were talking. You were there and we would call you out on it if you weren't there to participate. So there was this sense of shared accountability for the success of the school that was set up by having very clear goals that were communicated broadly to everyone, including parents. Folks monitored it in an ongoing way. They didn't just set a goal at the school year and then let it go. They revisited it constantly and talked about how well they were doing. Recognizing and rewarding students. There were several schools, high schools in particular, who put in place reward systems for students. One such system was Thinking Gold, where students were rewarded for how well they were doing academically, but also for coming to school. And it was very public, and they didn't do a whole lot, in terms of, it wasn't a very expensive program. They gave seniors and juniors lunch tickets so that they could go off campus, which was what kids really, really wanted. So, but what they talked about it doing was it built this culture of accountability for your own presence at school and how you're engaged in school and what's expected of you. And they saw that as being really instrumental to the success of the school, is building that student accountability. And lastly, using student data to intervene. We hear a lot about data-driven decision-making and being evidence-based, and it's certainly, I think, buzz language in our field right now. But one of the things that I was really struck by is that in these higher-performing schools that were talking about data, the data wasn't just we get data and look at data. They talked about what they did with the data. So they moved beyond just looking at it to intervene. They saw the data and then they changed things right away. There was it was instantly. They used the data to intervene, not just to review. So it was sort of used in an ongoing, frequent, reflective, sort of cycles of inquiry kind of way. And leadership, we've already talked about it, but leadership was another pathway. Many people talked about how they had a change in leadership that was the tipping point for their school. There's a number of characteristics that schools have to focus on to fuel their journey. That sort of summarizes what we've talked about. I'm not going to spend time on it now, but you can read more about it. But I'm going to end on this quote, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jane, who will talk more about this. But for me, this really illustrates, I think, one of the takeaways that I have from research in QEIA all these years is that QEIA is not really the program. QEIA is the infrastructure. It's the resources, as Jane talked about earlier. And when you go in and you ask schools, well, what has QEIA done for you? Or how has it been effective? They would say, well, it's not QEIA, it's the stuff that we're doing. QEIA just let us do that stuff. So I think that this really speaks to the importance of making good decisions even around LCFF, which Jane will talk about a bit more. But I've always really liked this quote because I think it talks about the importance of choosing what's going to work for your school, and that what works for you might not work for someone else.
So in the last couple of minutes, because I want to leave a few minutes for questions and answers as well, this was completely unplanned. Who knew, right? Looking back 7 years ago, who knew that we would be doing local control funding formula at the end of QEIA, and that there would be enormous parallels. You've heard about the parallels between these two things throughout. The first one, obviously, is that QEIA schools were specifically charged in the statute with improving instruction and achievement for pupils in schools that were characterized with high levels of poverty and complex educational needs. That's what they were asked to do. The second thing that Courtney just spoke about again was that this was an investment. It's not a program. LCFF is not a program. QEIA is not a program. It's an investment in an infrastructure, but it's depending on the local decision makers, parents, teachers, administrators, everybody in the education and the greater community to make the decisions about how to use those effectively because they know their context best. And the third thing that was often overlooked in QEIA was that in QEIA schools, they had funding flexibility, albeit it was much less than with LCFF, but they did have in the statute that they could use their categoricals, with their state categoricals, with a few exceptions like EIA funds, to support their goals. They did not have to, they were not bound by the normal requirements for spending those funds. So way before Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 funding flexibility, way before that, these schools had sort of the first cut of what funding flexibility would look like. So it was really, we call this a fortunate accident of timing, that these things have sort of occurred so that we can learn from them. I think when you look at the 8 state priorities under local control funding formula, there are some sort of immediate parallels that jump to mind. The pathways that Courtney was talking about that schools utilized overlap these state priorities in some ways really, really closely. So student engagement, which is one of the first and often the most talked about priority of these 8s, there are strategies that these schools used that really, really mattered in student engagement. Obviously, class size reduction was one, but it goes beyond the academic engagement, because what we've seen in these schools and what we've learned from these schools is that to a great extent, the engagement of students was not an academic transaction. It was a relationship or a personal transaction. Not surprising to people who work with students, but that the schools also took proactive steps. They did not wait for students to become engaged as if it was the students' responsibility. Of course, obviously, it is their responsibility, but it's not their sole responsibility to become engaged. They reached out and engaged them. So some of the programs like that Sparkling 10, those are examples that people can start looking at. It's interesting when you look, most of us watched or read or in some way touched on the approval yesterday at the state board of the local control accountability plan. The way that student engagement is sort of measured or defined is by a lack of dropping out, okay? But what we know from these QEIA schools is that you have to do more. It's not directly preventing the dropout, it's what are you gonna do? So again, these schools have some really important lessons to share with us. I think school climate is another one, another top priority. Again, school climate is the absence of certain indicators like suspension and or expulsion, things like that. But what we know, what we're finding out about school climate is that it really depends on a couple of things. This whole notion of accountability, of local accountability that Courtney talked about, made a big difference. And one of the things that I think she didn't mention as much is that the local accountability, obviously it meant that people were engaged and that they had a stake in it. But what local accountability, when you are meeting your own goals that you have set, it gives you an opportunity to experience your own success. And what we found with working with these schools is that that success is self-generating. So when you see success, it's human nature. You want more success. So one of the things that we're engaged in now, CTA is engaged in, is starting to look at many of these findings and how we can assist our members and the schools that we work with beyond QEIA schools to really look and see what are some of these things that we can actively apply to meet the new state priorities. Obviously, implementation of Common Core is huge, and a lot of the information on professional development and collaboration is going to come into play there. So the last thing I would kind of like to leave you with before we open it up for questions is this idea of, so how do we really capitalize on what we know? And one of the things that I would urge as we're moving into local control funding formula is to look beyond a needs assessment. Everybody is required to do a needs assessment, but a needs assessment in the way that it's typically or historically done really is looking at what are our deficits and how do we bridge the gap. And what we found in QEIA schools is oftentimes those schools moved more when they were able to express their priorities, when they were given an opportunity to aspire rather than just meet deficits. So we're working with this idea of looking at two factors as we move into working with schools under LCFF. And not only schools, but the whole community under LCFF. One is looking carefully at your capacity. Obviously, it's axiomatic that many initiatives are going to succeed or fail on capacity. So always be looking at, as we choose the goals that we're going to set under LCFF, and as we choose the specific activities to meet those goals, what's our capacity? That's the more kind of traditional needs assessment. But then look at, what are our priorities? What do we aspire to? How can we reach out into the community, reach our faculty, reach teachers, reach students, reach administrators, and say, what do you want to achieve? What are your aspirations? How can we use this for that purpose? And then looking secondly is, what's our level of commitment to those priorities? So and that's where you're gonna choose your goals and your strategies. One of the things that we know is that these are examples of schools that have been doing amazing work often, but they may not fit your local context. So it's that process of looking at your own capacity and your own commitment to support your priorities that's really going to make or break local control for you. And then, at that point, you're going to be looking at, so what goals and activities meet our capacity? What goals and activities meet our priorities or our commitments? I want to make sure that we get you out of here at 1 o'clock. We have about, 5 or 10 minutes to answer questions. So I'm going to ask Courtney to come back up, and if you have any questions, we'd be happy to field them.
The class size reduction, you had more humane and effective workload for teachers. And that allowed them to adjust their curriculum by assessments and build relationships with students. That also helped them build relationships with parents and collaboration with parents, which is part of the local control funding formula goals too. Because it seemed like it would. It seemed like if you had more time with your students, you'd also have more time with parents, which would help the climate.
I think we certainly had some teachers talk about that. I would say that it wasn't the really loud piece. It's interesting, parent involvement is really important, I think also, under LCFF. And I always want to look to the field, and we all struggle to figure out, okay, how do you deal with parent involvement? It's like this thing that we all know we need more of, but it's so difficult to get it,
Yeah.
So we had some schools put some important parent involvement pieces in place, but I don't think they drew the line to CSR. And so that's why we don't see it in there, because that's really the voices of teachers talking about it. I wouldn't be surprised if they did reach out, or it just didn't come up. They weren't talking about it as much. Okay. We're also dealing with schools that are in this, lower deciles. Parent involvement is a stupendous challenge, just a huge challenge for schools of that demographic makeup. And so, despite best efforts, we weren't seeing a lot.
Okay.
And so I'm going to piggyback a little bit on that, because one of the things, I get to step out of the research piece occasionally, and I will say, even though it did not come out, it wasn't loud in the research, we saw definite examples. Oxnard is an example where parents were totally mobilized when QEIA at their schools were threatened. It was amazing. It was sort of like this silent undercurrent, and then every once in a while you would see it surge. So obviously there is something there, even though we can't tap it. I don't want to. I believe there's something there, because it would show itself occasionally. Yes.
A couple areas that maybe tied, they're central to LCFF and the LCAP. Discuss. Did you look at under engagement? You briefly mentioned suspensions, expulsion, behavioral interventions. Did you look at that, especially the work coming out of UCLA, Dan Losen, Tia Martinez, and others, related to especially the willful defiance disruptive ones, any and how that ties with racial data, also a similar impact, the chronic absenteeism is measured. Are we telling kids not to come to school, and are we measuring if they are coming to school? You know, Eddie Chang's work. And then the third one, I think, that brings it together with engagement is all the work being done on 21st century skills in the language of, we're in our 14th year into the century. It's not in the future. But putting things in that language, including into behavioral intervention and attendance practices. Did you look at any of those?
You know, our main focus with these two reports was to look at what are we hearing from the field about how it was implemented and what the perceived impacts were. So, you know, we let what we heard from our stakeholders really drive that. You know, we'll have a last report that will likely answer a few different questions looking back, and we do have some access to some publicly available data on student, you know, discipline and truancy and some dropout rates. That we had the dropout rate formula change, you know, in the middle of our cycle, which was it makes it a little difficult to compare across years. But we may drill back into that data now. There's always been a bit of a delay with it, you know, that it comes out a couple of years after. So we may take a look, but we haven't looked specifically. This was really about the voices from the field. And so if those voices didn't give us that, that's not necessarily where we went for this report.
Data, the new suspension data, expulsion data should be out.
Yeah, so for our last report, you know, in terms of summarizing everything, that could be a really interesting question for us to ask.
Some of the approaches like restorative justice that a lot of districts are taking on, but we're working.
And the other thing is, there was only one of those indicators in QEIA, and that was graduation rate. So they were not at the, you know, 7 years ago, it was not built into the program in the same way. Not that it, you know, and then a graduation rate, even though it's in the statute, a benchmark for it was never set, what the increase should be. So it kind of got a little muted. Yes?
I know you said you intend to look at some of the schools that waive the CSR requirement. But I would be interested, as I'm looking at your analysis of the CSR process, it would be interesting to look at some of those QEIA schools who skipped kind of with phase 1 of CSR and see how much of phase 2 you actually saw in those sites. I don't know if that's something you looked at.
Yeah, you know, we're starting to look at it. One of the things that we've been doing is we've been tracking the waiver applications and the instances of waivers and the periods of time around waivers. And we're also looking at the applications and some of the rationale given for the waivers and doing some analysis of that. And we are linking whether a school has a waiver or not with their record. So we could drill in and take a look at that.
And I want to mention one other,
Oh, sorry.
well, I just want to mention one other thing. You know, poor Marcia's sitting here who tracks all those waivers at the CDE on QEIA. But one of the things that I want people to understand about waivers is they were not wholesale waivers. It was not, you don't do class size reduction. They may have, because class size was 20 to 1 in K3 and then 25 for the most part. I mean, there were some exceptions, but for the most part, it was 25 for 4 through 12, grades 4 through 12. So when the waivers were given, and correct me here, I think I've looked at most if not all of them, it was not like you no longer have class size. It may have been a slight modification, but they were still operating under some class size reduction. It just may have been a variance from where they originally started, especially if their target number was particularly low. We had one school whose target number, just because of the weirdness of the calculation, came out to be 9, okay? There were a lot of rural schools that only had one school, so that, you know, they would have this cohort going through. So there were some of, I would say a majority of those waivers were modifications. None of them, I don't think, were like a wholesale, we're not doing class size.
Yeah, no, for sure. Or it would be like certain class, like one grade level really had, you know, a huge influx of people for some strange reason. So it would be a modification for a short period of time, or I don't think that there would be no school that just got waived out of all of their CSR and could go up to 30 for the rest of the reform.
And they're nodding, so
Yeah.
so that is correct, yes.
Well, I would actually, and I know we're past time, so I want to end it. But I don't want to keep going with my question, but I would say that relative to the waivers, I think it's really important in your next report to look at Los Angeles Unified and how they were requested. And when you talk about modifications, a lot of them were relative to the mayor's proposal, the ramps of new schools and the changes they made there, the money trying to follow the students, the influx of Green Dot and some others. I think that's a big piece. And the majority of the waivers that came to the state board on this were not just CSR, but also TEI.
Yes. Yes.
And none were granted relative to API change.
Yeah.
There was only one API waiver
Yes.
that was
That was actually
granted.
a weird one.
It was a very weird
It
one.
really shouldn't follow it.
One of the things I love about this room is that it's always whatever time you want it to be. So in fact, we
I was
have
going to say,
time.
it's not even,
It's not even one yet, so we actually have time for one more question if there is another question.
I will just sort of say too, if you download this report, the Cultivating Change report, where we only have the highlights, there's some waiver analysis in there that talks about like the content and the different types and what percent of the waivers were granted to certain regulations. It's in that fuller report.
any other questions?
But if there are no more questions, I want to thank Jane and Courtney for the presentation. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month.